Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Brian Zawada. Brian is a VP of Strategy at Riskonnect, and he works with companies like Lockheed Martin and Aker solutions to monitor and mitigate complex organizational risk. Riskonnect is a leading integrated risk management software solution, and we had Jim Wetekamp, CEO, on our podcast several times already. Earlier, I think last year. So for those who are interested in our podcast with Jim, please go back about 1 year. So Brian, thank you for joining our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Boris. Nice to be here.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of geopolitical risk and what business leaders need to keep in mind as it relates to geopolitical risk and business continuity. But before we start, could you please, Brian, tell us a short story about your career path, what brought you to where you are now, and what you guide Riskonnect up to this day?
No, absolutely. So I've been in the business continuity and resilience profession for almost 25 years now. And so I've helped organizations all around the world both prevent disruption, but also build an effective capability to respond, communicate, and recover, regardless of what has affected their operations. So I've done that both in consulting capacity, but also as an internal practitioner as well.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, let's go back to our topic, because it's needless to say that geopolitical risk has risen sharply in recent years, increasingly affecting business in a wide range of ways. And especially we see after a Russian invasion of Ukraine, we see also tensions in the US-China relationship, or we see a lot of other geopolitical issues such as ESG related to geopolitics, some fuel shortages in Europe, and so many firms have little experience in understanding geopolitical issues and do not take a structured approach to understanding the potential impacts, whether strategic, financial, operational, and reputational. So this leaves us then with highly exposed in the face of structural increase of complexity. So Brian, as a business resilience strategy expert, can you provide us your kind of helicopter view and insight on the geopolitical issues companies need to watch out for today?
Absolutely. I think it starts with understanding your interests, and that includes not only directly where you have a nexus in terms of a location in an area that is potentially susceptible to geopolitical risk, but it's also where do your supply chains extend into or through from a logistics perspective. It's also about where your markets happen to be and where your key customers happen to be. So geopolitical risk can affect an organization directly, can affect it indirectly in terms of its people, its supply chains, and certainly its customers and markets as well. And so I think it starts with having a very strong understanding of yourself. Where do you have those dependencies? Where do you extend into a geography such as Ukraine or Eastern Europe? Where do you happen to have interests in the Straits of Taiwan, as an example? And how could a situation escalate, and what would be the downstream impacts? And of course, planning ahead for that. So it's a complex issue, but it really does start with knowing yourself. And there are many, many different techniques to being able to do that.
So what are the main strategies and technologies the world's biggest brands are implementing right now to address this risk of geostrategic or geopolitical risk, and how to ensure business continuity and you say for supply chain? Sometimes some countries even don't have a food chain problems after grain issues in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it starts with, first of all, I think there are many, many different people involved in understanding it and addressing this problem. So if I think about organizations that are more mature, or possibly you could also say more confident, that they'd be able to address situations where geopolitical risk spikes into an actual event, I think you start seeing different subject matter experts that have come together to connect the dots. People like, I'll call it product management, those that understand the go-to-market strategy for what they deliver. HR, they know where their people happen to be. And of course, in today's environment, many of our largest organizations are global and have interests in people just about everywhere. You have, of course, supply chain executives. You have logistics executives in terms of going through some of these hot spots, if you will, around the world. And then, of course, risk managers that are bringing it all together to really, shine a light, if you will, on those exposures. Business continuity professionals, as an example, also contribute. And they have many different processes that start with getting to know the organization. So business continuity professionals would understand the term business impact analysis. And it's not just understanding and trying to calculate the impact if a geopolitical risk were to materialize. It's really all about, how do I understand my dependencies, both up and downstream? How do I understand what are all of my processes, the resources I need, the suppliers that I need, their suppliers, the raw materials that contribute and come together to deliver a product and service, and of course, the customers and markets. And so it's really all about bringing all these people together. Oftentimes, we get into this mode where we react to crisis. In this case, we've got to be very proactive, understand our vulnerability, and put strategies and contingencies in place to address that. And in this case, those can be very, very complex strategies, such as substitution, maybe even having to redesign products and services to think about some of the key inputs that might be absent if a geopolitical event were to result in active conflict. So there's a lot to it here. And, I say it's a fascinating topic because it is, but unfortunately, it's a big challenge and it's very worrisome to large organizations that haven't really organized themselves to really proactively address it.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard that Apple is planning to increase production now in Thailand instead of China. So it's also having its effect, all these tensions.
Yeah, and when you think about China, Taiwan, and obviously it's in the news now, and many people are very worried about this. It's interesting because this is an area where you have so many different, implications, both logistics. When we think about how much raw material and product flows through that part of the world, semiconductors, which Taiwan delivers worldwide and impacts everyday life. Well, I don't think anyone's immune from that. So when you start getting into just those two small examples, it's a pretty cascading set of impacts if not managed appropriately.
Okay. So in your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes that businesses make when it comes to managing geopolitical risk? And
well, I think the biggest mistake right now, I think, is not thinking about, well, first of all, not bringing the right people together, identifying the dependencies, not conceptualizing how this could get worse and then continue to get worse. And the other part that I think is important is that it's one thing to say that geopolitical risk results in direct conflict and potentially has an impact on resources, logistics, so on and so forth. But in today's environment, another common mistake is understanding that there are some pretty strong expectations from markets, customers, governments regarding, who's my friend of my friend or the friend of my enemy. And you start getting into people picking sides. And picking sides results in policy. Some of those policies do have a direct impact, even if conflict was never to materialize. And so it's one thing to kind of keep a watch on when the temperature heats up, resulting in conflict. But it's another to understand and stay close to governments and policymakers to understand what's going on and what sanctions could be introduced, what are key customer segments demanding, and you can witness that social media and many other platforms. So it's complex, and that's why I look at this and say, got to connect the dots, got to understand yourselves, but you also have to understand how this could escalate above and beyond just direct conflict.
All right. So can you tell us what good looks like in the role of risk function, which is building kind of a geopolitical risk management framework?
Sure. Yeah, I think number one, as a risk manager, we oftentimes are called upon to bring people together. And so part of what good looks like is, number one, identifying all the different contributors that could help understand how big of a problem this is and what are our contingencies in the event of in the event something does materialize to affect our interests. And that's where that list of people that I brought up before, product management, logistics, HR, supply chain, the list goes on. And that the composition of that team that the risk manager brings together is going to differ by organization for sure. Second is building that early warning network or building situational awareness. Not only, depending on like watching the news, but what are we hearing about on the ground? What are we hearing about from different government stakeholder groups? What policies are they considering? What other government bodies, non-government bodies, or what are they considering as well? So building that situational awareness structure is huge. And just like any other threat to an organization, whether it's geopolitical, natural disaster, you name it, it really does come. How do you really understand your own internal dependencies? And what we're finding is that today, if I think about the business continuity profession, in years gone by, it was all about putting plans, documenting plans. Today, it's really about building a digital model of the organization that you can understand all your interdependencies. And if I look at this and I draw a circle around a geography and say, if something bad happened here, what are my interests? What are all the dependencies that could have been affected? That's key for that cross-functional team to be able to mine that information and understand kind of the what if.
All right, fantastic. So I would like to hear your personal opinion. What is the commonly held belief or kind of biggest misconception in the geopolitical risk management field that you strongly disagree with?
Yeah, I think number one is you've got to understand your assumptions that you're making. I think we saw this with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, is that a number of organizations looked to their people that were on the ground in Ukraine at one point and said, well, they don't feel like this is really going to happen. It's all just saber rattling. And I think we have to always understand the assumptions that we make and make sure that we recognize they're just assumptions, they're not fact. And I think that's extremely important. The other is that we always, just like any other threat or disruption, we have to manage the risk of an escalating crisis. If this may happen, well, how could it get worse? If it got worse, what are the implications there? What would we do? That's incredibly important. And then, of course, it's not just about having alternatives and substitution. It's really about, it's a huge part of this is communication, monitoring what the markets are saying, being in a position to talk to our suppliers, our customers, those that have a direct impact on our marketplaces. That's huge too. And so those are three common mistakes that I think we've seen play out with Russia and Ukraine. And I'm seeing more and more organizations really prepare better for situations such as China, Taiwan, if that unfortunately were to materialize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we look broader in the risk management organization, there are many kind of silos of risk. How can this geopolitical risk intersect with other types? For example, you have now ASG, cybersecurity, supply chain, and
Sure.
What can businesses do to prepare for those integrations or intersections?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the point that I was bringing before is that you don't wait to make introductions to your peers when it comes to a risk once something has happened. you hope to have built those relationships well in advance. You see organizations put together what they might call risk committees, risk councils, risk steering committees, brought to representatives that have decision-making authority to help the organization prepare for certain vulnerabilities, and of course also be involved in the response. And so it would be a mistake to wait until something is just about imminent or has already taken place before people have gotten together, because it's so important to build those relationships, learn how to work as a team together in advance, and certainly know how to convene again to be able to address things as they continue to unfold. And so unfortunately, I've seen over the years many times that the first time someone meets one another is during the actual crisis. Well, hopefully organizations are connecting the dots, building those teams well in advance. And like you said, it's many of those job titles I mentioned. I'm glad you brought up cyber as an example, because certainly that is a big worry when it comes to these type of geopolitical risks, as kind of an alternate, call it alternate front, if you will, in the war. As actual conflict occurs, but then there's the cyber front, and obviously organizations are so dependent upon their information technology infrastructures and networks.
Absolutely, yeah. We hear it's this every day, and every time of the day there are different cyber security episodes. Yeah.
Oh, it's certainly top of mind for everyone. That's for sure.
Yeah. So interesting about your perspective about where do you think the geopolitical risk as a whole, kind of new science or whatever, is heading? What are the trends in the space, and what should we expect from this risk management people who are in the trenches to stay up to the information?
Yeah, I think number one, it's what's interesting, and it's a timely conversation, not just because there's active conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but even with so much conversation about who's taking whose side and what does that mean, and so we're seeing that play out in the news right now globally, through social media posts, intelligence leaks, things like that. And there is a strong chance that people will overreact to that, make decisions both for their business, for their countries, and the like. We've had such a trend for so many years about globalization of business. And as you get into some really interesting choices that people are making in terms of picking sides, trying to nearshore their resources, identify alternates sourced from their perceived friends, but it's interesting how that could change so quickly. And so it's the current events are, number one, staggering, but number two, the speed at which things are changing due to social media and other, obviously, modern communication methods and how people are engaging only potentially ratchet up the potential tension that and how fast things could materialize globally. So it's a very interesting time. Certainly current events with, some of what's happened in the United States with intelligence leaking and indicating some of the who's picking whose sides and overreacting to that potentially and treating it as fact when it may not be. It's a very, very interesting time that only complicates, the geopolitical issues that we see as a headline grabber right now.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think it was great information. And to summarize, if for someone who is listening to this episode would like to walk away with just one or two major takeaways, what would it be?
Number one, I think it's making sure that you have put together the right team, not just to respond to an event, but to really understand the potential implications of geopolitical issues and tensions, number one. So based on what the sector, your geographic footprint, so to speak, bring the right people together that understand the go-to-market strategy and how you've connected your end-to-end business processes that deliver products and services. I mean, that's number one. Number two, build that digital model of your organization that you can essentially consult to understand your key dependencies. And then number three, make sure you have a very good set of contingencies or maybe substitutions, if you will, so that in the event geopolitical tensions do flash into actual conflict, that you do have the ability to understand your alternatives. And that includes everything from raw materials through logistical processes and of course, understand how to reach those suppliers all the way through the customer. So those would be probably my top three, Boris.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian, very well. Those were all my questions. Perhaps if I forgot something, would you like to add whatever you want to that benefit our audience?
No, and if anybody would like to discuss this further with me, I can certainly be reached on LinkedIn or brian.zawada@riskonnect.com. I'm happy to discuss this topic further with any of your listeners, Boris. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. And I hope we will invite you and your colleague in the future to our podcast or in our community on the globalriskcommunity.com. Thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you.